But I don't think that you connecting with a platform, your information should be used in other ways or negative ways. And that's where I think the struggle is, right? Because I don't blame the user for wanting to connect with people, right? Like these platforms have created connection points that have never happened in many ways, right? In the early days, it was like single moms that were using these forums as well, right? People with disabilities, people who, had social anxieties and couldn't leave their homes. And so it's important for us to think about, yes, there is a real reason why we use these platforms, but what are the governance models outside of these multinational corporations that can ensure that our experiences aren't used against us in negative ways, right? That we're able to be protected, whether it's by government or by better, regulation around these platforms.
How do we protect ourselves from Facebook? Nasma, what do you think of that question? And is that even the question we should be asking?
Okay, sorry. This is not working so well. Okay, hello everybody. I don't know if that's the question that we should be always asking, because I think that there are going to be always different social media platforms, whether be it Twitter, Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. And so I don't necessarily think that's the question to ask. I think that there is a larger conversation about data collection and data usage and data privacy that goes beyond just Facebook as a platform, but it goes to other social media platforms and other technologies that we use. So I think that is actually the bigger question, and sometimes Facebook is the one that we go to first, but it's beyond that as well.
Yeah, Bianca?
That's a really good answer. It's a lot of the same thoughts. I also think it's important when we talk about protecting ourselves from Facebook is knowing that it's a pretty big deal what's happening right now. I think it's easy to be like, oh, it's Facebook or it's this, or there was one issue, or we have to figure it out. I think we're really in the middle of something that is full of unintended and not understood consequences. And I think it's hard sometimes to be the alarmist who has to keep saying, this is really important. We really need to do something. We really need to do something, especially when it's become such a social norm. So I think that there's a tension there, that there's a lot of good stuff, but there's also some really big issues that we need to think about. So I think protect from Facebook, and really think about protecting ourselves from technology, maybe, to broaden it out, or thinking about the implications of the internet, really getting it bigger than one or two, firms that are obviously, at the heart of it right now.
Well, for you as a prominent voice on these issues, and as a critic, what do you say to people when they say, but I like Facebook and I kind of knew this was happening and what's the big deal and times are changing? How do you navigate those conversations? Because for a lot of Canadians, Facebook is not just the day-to-day, it's the hour-to-hour of how people share their lives.
Yeah, I think I start by saying, I like them too. And that's exactly, what we have to think about, is that these platforms and the internet is bringing us wonderful opportunities to connect. I like to tell people about my experience when I was pregnant with my first child. I was on Twitter a lot, but I was passively reading, Black feminist Twitter, because I was never schooled in feminism, and it's I got to leapfrog and learn so much passively without asking for, and not engaging or being uncomfortable, and just being able to sit with it by myself. And that's a big opportunity for learning, right? That's one place where you think, wow, that is for me, that was a significant opportunity. Now, if we go into some of the challenges, I think the biggest challenge is that we don't think we have agency over these things. So the way that you just talked about it, this is the future, this is here, this is just adapt to it. No, humans make technology. We drive these technologies. So they do what we want them to do. So we have to figure out how we, flip that narrative, because this is not just happening and it just has to happen this way. This is absolutely not true. And that's part of the power of a lot of, these, the platforms and the technology industry, and the way that it presents itself as the future, and, everything is wonderful and fine. And the last piece I'll say with that is that the government is in thrall with these companies, which makes this extremely hard, because they're supposed to be regulating them, not thank you, come on in and make jobs for everybody, right? Which is kind of the way that this gets boosted, is we think about the economic impact of these companies now instead of the social impact. So there's a lot of complexity in there, but we really need to understand that we're in charge of these companies and we have laws, and laws are in charge. We're in charge.
It makes me think of when Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook testified in front of Congress. I was shocked to see the level of understanding from senators of Facebook, demonstrated by the questions they were asking. And when I entered the 47 ward race for city council, one of the things I thought I could offer if elected was an understanding of tech, of data, of government 2.0. My question for you is, where do you think in Canada, federal, provincial, and municipal politicians or candidates in this case, because we do have municipal elections underway across the country, are when it comes to these issues? Do they understand these issues? Are they discussing these issues?
I guess the one example that I can provide was around Sidewalk, which was an interesting one. The Sidewalk.
You want to, maybe explain?
Yeah,
to the
so
audience?
Sidewalk Toronto, an initiative, in partnership between Sidewalk Labs, which is owned by Alphabet, which also owns Google, and Waterfront Toronto, to develop the waterfront, where you call the East. Well, things have changed around that, but and so they're currently in the consultation phase around building up their master development plan. And when that was announced, there was excitement across the board, right? So on the province level, on the federal level, and on the local level, but slowly, right, issues started to be brought up. And I think what was really interesting about that case scenario is that there were some councillors that were worried, right? Like they were worried about what it meant for a large company something that's owned by a large company to participate, right, in discourse in the city and to be able to support the development of that area. And so there were concerns, but I think a lot of folks were also excited about the economic development opportunity. And I think that's something Bianca was also talking about, is that we often get really excited around economic development and not about the social impacts of these kind of projects. And I could say the same case around Facebook Cambridge Analytica, and that essentially opened up the door to show that people were using information to just change people's minds around how they were going to vote. And so and 600,000 Canadians were impacted by about 600,000 Canadians were impacted by that. And you could see really quickly that people were concerned around privacy, but then not a lot of people were interested in changing the rules around it. And actually, at one point, which we can talk about, there was a committees that actually stated recommendations that weren't taken on. And so I think that the understanding right now is still more of an excitement than of a concern. I do think that there are people who are bringing up their concerns, but they're quite small compared to the larger economic development play that's being thrown at us as why would you care about that when there's development, right? And why do you care about that if there are jobs? And I don't think those two are separate. So I think you probably have also things to say about that.
Yeah, and to start back to your example of when Facebook was before Senate, I thought that was a perfect example. I think it was Senator Al Franken was, he went on a tear that people seem to appreciate, which was you couldn't tell when people were buying ads in rubles for this, that they were trying to do a thing. You look at the Facebook person being no, that's not we're not set up to be thinking about election management. This is, and so I'm watching that, because people are yeah, get Facebook, right? Go Senator, go. And I'm thinking U.S. government, you're in charge of elections. You're in charge. It's not up to Facebook to be in charge of elections.
Are they in charge of elections?
Yes. Yes, they are in charge of elections. And if you're this fired up about it, go back to your office and find out how to get some people helping you understand what's going on. Because this idea that we're giving this, authority, social authority, or kids, this is not legal, to look to people in leadership from these, multinational corporations to be in charge of things with this kind of impact, to me is we're forgetting our roles. So I don't think. Not only do I think that, no, people aren't ready to be managing these issues at any level of government, nor do I fault them, nor do we have any idea. I think it's even comical whatever companies are saying, there's 10 years worth of development that nobody in the public even knows about is going on within tech companies. So to even think if you were at the cutting edge of someone who can speak publicly about tech, they're not even in the circles that you need to be in if you're the government to manage it, right? So this needs like deep investment in also building the technical capacity back within government. And I'll end on that point, which is what's awful, is that our governments right now are under such austerity, and this is a long tail trend, that if they were to hire some of the talent that we desperately need, people would be like, oh, this public service is getting bloated. This is too expensive. They're making what? Yeah, we need them inside. I know that we have great people working on security, but that's, very different than across the board government application of technology. So it's all, we can fix it, but we as the public are going to need to be both okay with that expenditure and asking for that kind of, reform.
Just want to remind the audience that we have a hashtag, which is hashtag on civil society. So feel free to tweet along, to share on these platforms, as well as to engage with each other. And we also want to come to you for questions, not just at the end. So I'm going to ask another question to the panel, and then we're going to open up to you. So if you do have some questions early on, we'll take them. And then we'll also come back at the end to continue the Q&A there. It is very rare to be on a tech panel with other women. So I just want to highlight that. Yeah, very rare. And it's exciting. And I want to bring up the intersectionality of this discussion. And I'd like to start with you, Nasma, because it's a big part of the work that you're doing. How does this conversation play out when we're looking at race, gender, class, people living with disabilities, et cetera? Because so often it's just one group that's even part of this conversation.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we're doing with the Digital Justice Lab is really trying to navigate and understand how we can bring diverse voices into how we think about technology policy, for example. I do think that it's really imperative for us to have a variety of voices as we engage in these conversations about the impact on Facebook, on democracy, but also on the impact of data collection and the impact of multinational corporations, because often the people who are the most impacted, right, by massive amounts of data collection, for example, are poor folks, are Black, Brown, Indigenous folks. And so it is really important for us to really think through, how we engage people in these conversations and recognize that there are reasons why people use these platforms, right? I imagine in many ways, it reminds me of social enclaves, right? We think about that in physical spaces, right? Communities come together because they have a similarity, right? Or whether it's cultural background or religion, and they have an enclave, right, in a physical form. And it could be a, Little Italy or whatever it is. And, people create those social enclaves in digital spaces, right? And for a lot of folks, this is their way of connecting with other people around the world. For diaspora, as people have migrated, this is an opportunity for them to talk to people, in different countries. And so I don't ever fault people for wanting to use these platforms in the way that they should, but I do fault the fact that we don't have policy set in place to be able to govern what happens. And you think about the larger impact, for example, Myanmar is a really good case example of, ads and stories that literally led to violence and genocide. And so, the reason why I provide this example as well is the reason why diverse voices are needed in these spaces is also a lot of these platforms test out their products in what we'd call the global south. And I say quote because I don't like that. But they test these products in all these other places and then don't actually have any way of thinking about the social ramifications of it, even though activists would say, hey, letting you know this fake news is actually leading to mass amounts of violence, and it was ignored, right? And so, and it's important for us to think about that. And for example, RCMP using Facebook profiles to track activists here in Canada. And so, these intersections, as we think about what the future could look like, we need to ensure people are a part of those conversations because, they're using this as a way of connecting. They're using it as a way of protesting, and they're using it as a way of knowing more about what's happening in their communities, and then that's being used against them, right? And so, yeah, I think no matter what the case is, that we need to ensure people's voices are not only a part of it, but shaping it. we have a really interesting opportunity in here in Canada to actually shape digital policy, right? Like we have an opportunity to think about national data strategies, to think about privacy policies, and to think about privacy law. And this is an opportunity for us to be able to engage in a way that we might have not been able to engage in before. Because yes, there are experts, but to be honest, a lot of us are just like going with the flow. We're trying to learn as we go, right? Because these issues are arising and different problem sets are coming up. And so this is an opportunity for us to engage in collaborative policy building and build public education around these issues because it is impacting us in different ways. And we have such an amazing opportunity to shift that. It's just, let's see if it's going to actually happen.
And ironically, some of this technology is allowing us to do that and to collaborate and to be part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's see if there are any questions from the floor. There's a microphone set up. Okay, great. Okay, excellent. So just put your hand up and we'll take a few questions and again, we'll come back at the end. But yeah, let's start here in the front. And just a reminder, a question is a short statement that ends with a question mark. Yeah. And if you could say your name and... I understand. Sorry.
Okay, my name is Amira, yeah, and I'm deaf. I'm a deaf person. I just wanted to comment about what you were just saying about the black people, Indigenous people, and other groups, and discussions or conversations on Facebook. But deaf people in the deaf community is so small. Mm-hmm. So we don't speak only with sign. Mm-hmm. In our whole lives, we struggle with problems with Facebook and communication with each other. So we need to communicate with. Facebook's very important for people that are deaf because it's a more open approach to communicate. We've always had so many struggles and with communication. So it's really allowed us, the technology has really allowed us, deaf people, to be more equal with people that are hearing. So it's a good platform for us in that respect.
I would like to say that yes, and that's the benefit of these platforms, that it connects people right across the board. But I don't think that you connecting with a platform, your information should be used in other ways or negative ways. And that's where I think the struggle is, right? Because I don't blame the user for wanting to connect with people, right? Like these platforms have created connection points that have never happened in many ways, right? In the early days, it was like single moms that were using these forums as well, right? People with disabilities, people who, had social anxieties and couldn't leave their homes. And so it's important for us to think about, yes, there is a real reason why we use these platforms, but what are the governance models outside of these multinational corporations that can ensure that our experiences aren't used against us in negative ways, right? That we're able to be protected, whether it's by government or by better, regulation around these platforms, so that it's not something that turns into a negative, that it can be the place that is beautiful. And this is the contention that we have now.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for signing as well. All right, see some other hands up. You can tell us who you are.
My name is Cynthia. One of the panelists said that the government, this Facebook issue shouldn't really just lie on the hands of the government. I don't know whether that meant that the corporations are off the hook or not, because in my mind, corporations have a social responsibility, so that absolutely they have to take care of it. And even in the design stage, as you're mentioning, we should be designing a platform that's safe and private. It's our choice. If I want to be public, I have a choice to be public, and not that the company can take advantage of. But now, of course, even the public, the government definitely has to protect us. But even us, we have to take a responsibility to educate ourselves. And I think maybe that's part of the reason why we're all here. So I just want to clarify, are we saying that the corporations are off the hook and everybody is off the hook?
It's a great question. Bianca, do you want to take this one? What's the relationship and responsibility, government, tech, I should say big tech, because we're really talking about them, and then citizen?
Yeah. I mean, I think the corporations have a governance contract with their shareholders, and profit is always the priority in their legal framework with their shareholders. So I think that always has to be the starting point of that conversation, is that even though they can, and they have used this to great marketing success, has also started to use the ideas around social responsibility and other things, that they'll take care of those things. But I think the responsibility for that, while it is shared amongst parties, the government needs to be one that in some cases is regulating what is legal and what is not legal. Because we're talking about abuses, right? So there's a difference between making a platform available and making sure it's safe and people having choice about what they share, absolutely. But is it clear that when you do something that you're consenting to these other things happening to you? Right now, I would argue consent is not very clear for people. That you're giving your data and you're getting a benefit, but there's a lot of other things being done to you that you're not being told in a clear way. So I think that sort of regulation, that's an opportunity for the government to make sure that, yes, they can, make sure that these products are available, but under certain conditions. And I think those conditions are what the laws and policies are there for. And the reason that's good is because we drive those laws and policies. And I think that's a great opportunity. If everybody kind of comes out and says, I don't mind if everybody has all my data and they do these things with it, then that's democracy, right? And in some cases, maybe what I don't like becomes law, but that's part of our system. But it shouldn't be happening just by default with what the corporations want to do. And I think just a second sort of related point to this, which gets back to different communities using these platforms and everything else. If you go back to, the 1990s, and right now we're living with social constructs and norms that were developed by a handful of white, able-bodied men in California. They're dictating the social construct and sort of social engineering and in choices, this kind of choice architecture of the internet. It is, if that's who designs a thing, we all know what comes with that. I mean, there's a real sort of white supremacist structure that comes along with, the identity of the people who've created a lot of these products. It doesn't matter if it's intentional or not. And I think this is one thing I want to be really, really clear about. Does everybody remember when the Grenfell Towers fell apart in the UK? There is this saying that I can't find the attribution, but basically any sufficiently advanced form of neglect is indistinguishable from malice. Mm-hmm. And this is the idea that it doesn't have to be malice. These corporations aren't evil. These men weren't evil. I don't think anybody meant to do something that was super harmful to people. It doesn't mean that it can't happen. Right? And I think that's what's happening right now, is that it's a whole bunch of stuff we didn't think about. And now we're seeing who's disproportionately being impacted by that sort of negligence by the state and by lawmakers. I think that's where we're at in this conversation right now.
And do you think these conversations are also happening in those circles in Silicon Valley?
I do, but it goes back to this same thing where if you talk to a Silicon Valley, maybe a young person in Silicon Valley, I give you an analogy to make this really clear. Even in Canada, I was talking to some people who were students in a geography program, and I was saying, it's really problematic that Uber came into the city, drove over the government, and went straight to a whole bunch of users through the internet. Everybody loved Uber at that point, and it made it really hard to legislate because now you had all these consumers using, and I'm saying this, and the professor's going and I'm like, what? And he's like, they don't care. He's like, they don't care if if the product's good, that's okay. And this is a population of students. I would never say that represents everybody, but I mean, this is this is the end of a privatization trend we've been on for a long time. So when I even think about in Silicon Valley, I don't care if everybody thinks this is a great version of the future. If we're not part of that conversation, it's not something for somebody to just do, because we're getting into really libertarian, individual-based behavior. I can do a thing, it's super convenient for me, and I don't care what it is for you. Might be great for me, awful for you, but I don't care what it does for you if it works well for me. That's not a collective thinking, that's breaking liberal democracy. We need to think about each other. Technology is not set up generally to do that with a lot of these big platforms.
Yeah, and I would say that it's not only the Valley, right? Like now what we're experiencing in Toronto and Waterloo and BC, Ottawa, is like a rise of a very particular kind of techno solutionism. You know, technology is great and sexy. It's going to solve all of our problems. It's going to create all these jobs. And we're having the same rhetoric, right? Repeated over and over again all across Canada. And a good example of that is the $750 million, the combination of $750 million that was invested in Toronto, I think was it last week? It was Microsoft, Uber, and a couple of other players who were going to be building, creating jobs and doing all of these really, quote unquote, wonderful things. And I see that and I hesitate. And the reason why I hesitate is not because I don't think Canadians deserve economic development. I hesitate because I've seen what's happened to the Bay Area. I've seen what's happened to the rising cost of housing. We're already dealing with affordable housing crisis here in Canada, and in particular in Toronto. And, I think about what are the rising costs? What are the community benefit, right, of companies expanding? And us thinking about the fact it's also predominantly American companies that are expanding in the Canadian space. And so how do we navigate what the community benefit is of these corporations, for example? Because it sadly isn't all fine and dandy. In the Valley, they thought it was going to be like that too, right? Like they thought, oh, it's going to be great, it's going to be wonderful, until public servants couldn't live there anymore, right? And so it's not just about living, it's about schools, it's about a bunch of other things that are interacting with our physical life that we may have not ever expected. And so how do we learn from what's happened in the Valley and what's happened in New York and Seattle and potentially learn from that?
Great. Let's take another question. Perhaps in the back, we've taken a lot from the front. Okay, we'll take this one and then we'll get one to the back. Okay. I see you in the back. I see you. Yeah.
Okay. My name's Caroline Gray, and I wanted to ask a question of Bianca, or first a comment, if I may. There are standards that are being developed. I imagine you're aware of them by IEEE and the MIT project. So it's not as though no one is thinking about this, but there is definitely a huge amount more work to be done. And I guess my question is on that front, there doesn't seem to be, none of you have talked about any projects that you're aware of here that are being done on that. And do you think that's just that you don't know about them, or that literally Canada is not making this a priority in its federal or any level of government?
Yeah, to your first point, there's definitely stuff going on in the standards body MIT, but I think, again, we get into that replication of a very elite set of people who are represented in those communities for the most part. Like, I think what I'm concerned about is the lack of broad public engagement on the topic, because the technology industry tends to take this approach where everything's fine and will mitigate stuff. Rarely do they say no, or that's illegal, or we're not doing that. That does generally not come from that community. That's, again, broad brush. But I think, so yes, there's lots going on, but I think it still suffers from this issue of, broader public engagement as a community. To your second point, I think there's a lot of stuff going on. However, it's the commercialization of those models to make them, broad enough to have alternatives, right? Like open source software is a great example of something that has a lot of opportunity to it. Like there's a lot of ways that we could be using open source software or figuring out models where they're community supported, but they have to hit this level of, again, broad use for them to be sustainable. I don't think the government is doing a great job in funding that kind of technology, right? Like I think we could be government as first buyer, supporting a lot of different kind of thinking around open source and, investing in communities to build their own capacity, to run their own networks, to decentralize things, to do all of those things, because I love technology. This is what's really difficult for me, is to watch it and say, there's not only ever one way to do a thing, you can do it many ways. But again, this gets us back to the point of the economic development narrative being the dominant one. And in Canada, our number one thing has been, in the history of Canada, we want to attract investment, right? And that's how, and that we measure success by jobs created. And when I talk to Canadian entrepreneurs, they say that is not the kind of metrics that we should only be thinking about. So, there is lots of stuff going on. I just don't think it's at the size or scale that it should be, and it needs more support. And that's, and that tends to need money.
Okay. Microphones in the back.
So, of course, thank you for getting this wonderful talk. One thing I would like to actually direct a thing, not to any specific member of the panel, but I've met some people who have dealt with cases with like data collection, and they go like, yes, yes, yes to everything, and say, well, why are you hiding? Let them have it and show them that everything's clean. And I'm like, I ask them, why? That's not even how our laws work. It's the default state's hidden, and I guess is how do we get people to understand that privacy is not about just hiding things that are meant to be, they're bad or to be hidden, but it's a default state until the authorities prove that they need to get it, that it should remain hidden by default unless they wish to share otherwise. How do you get that point across so it's no longer that threat?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I do a lot of programming around like digital security and digital safety. And so that's often a big thing that's posed is like, oh, I don't mind because I have nothing to hide. And it's really interesting. Those conversations often switch when I provide case examples.
What's your favorite one? Do you have one that you like to?
Ooh, I think one thing that's been really interesting is talking to young people about jobs. So the landscape of how people are hiring has shifted a lot. And so a lot of the practices that people have around oversharing or whatever the case is online can sometimes be used against you in hiring practices. And that wasn't my way of shaming anyone for sharing what they need to share online, but people are using algorithms to assess people's applications through like a scan of their social media accounts, right? And so, it's important to think about, even if you have nothing to necessarily hide, that you need to know what your digital footprint is, right? And so that's one of the kind of case examples that are more real to a lot of people who are applying for jobs, especially young people who have been online, most of their life, if you're living in like urban areas, for example. And so I think a lot of it is just education. I think it's, it's really funny because I think we were taught that like you have nothing to hide. But I do think that inherently we know that we don't want everything shared in an explicit way. We don't want, for example, your Fitbit information when you have like you're tracking your health and then you find out later that might be used for insurance purposes, right? The use case scenarios, I think, is what kind of freaks people out. That's when people are like, oh my God, like, are you serious? And so I think it's a lot of an education piece. It's figuring out what your digital footprint is. And then from there, thinking about how much do you need to know to make an informed decision? Bianca and I talk about this a lot, right? In every project, like public consultation is super important. And the biggest piece is how much do you have to know to make an informed decision about if you're okay with, for example, Fitbit being used for insurance purposes, that's okay and that's fine. But like, how much do you need to know? And that's the biggest piece, is that it's very hard for us to use imagery and all of these other pieces to think about where that information is going because of how broad and big it's become. And so I would suggest there's a really good tool called Digital Data Detox. It's by Tactical Tech in Berlin. And it's a really good way of kind of navigating what your digital footprint is and like kind of pinpointing where, you might have accounts that you didn't realize and what you might have shared. And it's, once again, not used as a way of shaming people for having a digital footprint, but more of like, the more you know about what you have out there, the better it is for you to navigate how you feel about it. And it becomes difficult, obviously, because we're on several platforms. But I think the biggest thing is more of like a knowledge, is like when people know that things are being used for other reasons, nefarious reasons sometimes, that it helps them kind of get out of the privacy is, just for hiding, because actually I believe privacy is inherent, right, in many ways.
So next year we have a federal election, and we found out this week in the Toronto Star that despite recommendations from a committee that represented the different parties around how political parties can use data, that no actions will be taken. And right now, political parties are not subject to the same privacy laws as corporations. So on this point of education and what we know, what should we be thinking about when it comes to political parties in Canada and the access they have to our information?
I guess the quicker thing that we can think about is data breaches. So, if you're not following, like, for example, privacy law for corporations, you don't have to disclose if you have a data breach, which is really interesting, right? So a political party that you might provide information to does not have to disclose if at any point it was compromised, which is an important thing to navigate, especially because We know the role of especially foreign players, not only foreign players, but also internal players, in playing around with people's perspectives. And so I think it is important to think about if you can't even share a data breach, or you're not willing, or you're not forced to, what that impact can have. But there's lots of other pieces. It's unfortunate, but you want to go for it?
Yeah, I was speaking to someone about the Cambridge Analytica affair and the manipulation of voters. And this person said to me, Barack Obama was like the Facebook king. Like, this is a thing that's been used before the most recent election. And before that, you can get into Karl Rove, like getting into profiling people that you want to vote for you. So I think some of that is older and more fundamentally rooted in, activities of political parties. I think the fact that it's not disclosed goes to show you how far down this retail politics road we've come. In my existence of, 40 years now, and not all of them thinking about politics, but, when I started to realize, I think partisan politics is for a lot of people unattractive because all of these things are assumed, you're going to go and you're going to profile a bunch of people and figure out how to make them do the thing that you want them to do. And that's not the kind of politics that, it's in my Pollyanna version of how we would do, discourse and be out there and talking. We wouldn't be using these tools, but these tools are much older. And I think we don't have the broad discourse we should be having because of the way a lot of the parties operate, just retail politics. So I think this is one of those cases where we're looking at this edge piece of it, but it's a much deeper element of how our politics operate right now that is problematic.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing is that there should have been more political will. Because after Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, the news kind of came out. Everyone thought it was just the US, right? And then we found out it was 600,000 Canadians that were impacted by it. And that opened, and there was also a Canadian organization that was also doing similar things as well, that was based here, and that had to also deal with proceedings. And so, I think a lot of people, especially in the privacy community and the security community, was like, this is our moment. Everyone was like, everyone cares about data collection now. This is the moment to shift things. And so a lot of people really thought that there was going to be a political will to at least have small changes. So for example, thinking about political parties following privacy laws, right? And that didn't happen. So it was a disappointment. I think a lot of people were very disappointed because it was one of the things that in the grand, obviously we can talk about national data strategies, we can talk about bigger, data protection initiatives. But this was one of the things that could have happened before the election. You know what I mean? It could have happened before the federal election. And a lot of experts were asking for it. It was part of a recommendation where all three parties had representation, and they made that recommendation. And so the biggest thing is the political will. So I guess for us as people who may participate, is that it's important for us to think about what we want to see, right? If the political will wasn't there when the announcement came out, and people weren't willing to change at that point, because I thought for a fact that should have happened, right? I thought it was this is perfect. This is you have your news story that will help guide the policy. We know it's pretty cookie cutter in that regards. And because it didn't happen, I think we have to be a little bit more concerned about how the elections are going to go, and, thinking about disinformation and thinking about the amount of information political parties collect on us, and really trying to make the decision of, for example, if you're, a Liberal Party member, what do you want from the Liberal Party, right? Or if you're an NDP, or if you're a progressive conservative, it might have to happen more internally, right? But the unfortunate thing is that people want to play the game, right? We can't, the privacy law would have leveled the playing field, but now it's a political will within the party, and that makes it really difficult when you want to win an election. And so mass amounts of data collection is what they often is an easier bet to pick the voters, right? And so if you're a party member, I guess these are questions that you might have to ask.
Think a lot about proactive versus reactive. And I will say, as someone who worked inside one of the big tech companies working at Twitter, when I joined in 2016, we were grappling with a very big abuse and harassment problem. And then we became more proactive thanks to the voices on Twitter, thanks to pressure from journalists and activists, as well as clients. And then got to the point where we were actioning 10 times the number of accounts and not fully getting on top of it, but doing a better job. And then we see the rise of disinformation. And I use the term disinformation because when Donald Trump is saying fake news and attaching it to CNN, New York Times. It's a problematic term. So disinformation, when information is deliberately misleading and spread, and then misinformation, when you think something is true and you spread it. So now we're seeing with the rise of disinformation on social media, not particularly new, but at the rate that it's moving and the impact that it's having, I'm seeing it yet again, where companies are finally getting on top of, say, abuse and harassment. And again, there's still a lot of work to be done. Then something else comes on. And I just still think they're in this reactive state. So how do we balance? How do we get ahead? And obviously, part of it is these conversations and pressures, because we know it works. But you bring up Uber, same thing, that reactive versus proactive. And whoever's proactive has the advantage.
Yeah. And I want to riff on this for a minute about you said fake news, but I've always found this conversation really problematic because we're jumping over a super problematic part of our news media right now, which is that if you look at newsrooms, they're really white, right? So this idea that journalism is in crisis right now because it has a funding problem or because fake news is happening is not to say it's not real. But I like to go back to Noam Chomsky here and his sort of manufacturing consent thing, where he's calling the New York Times the lapdog of the president, as sort of like this. He talks about the political class, the 20% of people who pay attention to the media, and then that's propaganda for that group. And I think we will have to watch out, thinking skipping over the fact that we're not reporting daily on poverty in Toronto, as like that we're not consistently addressing racial inequity in newsrooms. Because if we're just twiddling at the edges of these new problems, and we still have this structural problem in its base, it's a really hard conversation, because I think sometimes we proactively jump on the newest problem and we don't go back to address the root problem. And this is what technology is amazing, at getting people's focus. This 20% political class, that sort of techno people are in there and saying, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? But some of the structural problems are much older and haven't been addressed. And if they don't get fixed, all this other stuff is really sort of like twiddling at the edges. You know what I mean? So that's just what, in this discourse, I don't want to skip that part, because sometimes I think we all get into everything was great until the internet and news. And it's like, no, that's not true. Right?
Yeah, and I do think that I think it's really important to think about the elite when it comes to this conversation, just because when you actually read some of the articles that we know are trying to mislead people, it's really hard to know that's the case, right? Like, some of the stories look extremely real, and it's difficult even with someone with a media literacy background to kind of parse through, right? Like, there's different things that people use, right? They check the URL and they see if there's anything funny going on, right? And then you check the other links. And I find that it's so difficult to parse it through, even if you have a media literacy background, that we have to think about what is the impact on larger populations that maybe don't have the media literacy background. And that's obviously why it worked really well. And important to recognize that the spread of this news was rooted in anti-Blackness, in anti-immigration rhetoric. For example, in the American context, they knew, right, that if you push people to the limit, right, and just based it off of the fact that you did not want to support, Black folks, you didn't, you were against poor people, you got to work until you get your money, and you got to work for your house, and immigrants are taking your jobs. They knew that was the rhetoric to use in the United States, right? Which talks to the bigger problem about how a lot of what we're seeing right now around misinformation, disinformation, is also rooted in larger political issues that are happening, and that it's only being manifested in very specific ways, which is terrifying, right? It's how the Russians knew to use very particular ways of getting far right wing, or even getting people who are on the center to be towards a far right, for example. They knew how to do that, and all of it was tied to racism. It was tied to xenophobia. And so I think it is a larger structural issue. And unfortunately, it makes it difficult for platforms to navigate that, right? And I talk of the Myanmar example, and I have to because that was one of those cases where activists had been asking Facebook repeatedly that this is happening and you're not listening to us. And this is leading to genocide and you're not listening to us. The spread of like literally fake news at that point, that was the term that was being used, is killing people, and they did not listen. And it was only until like after obviously the hearings and everything like that was the case. And so I know it's very difficult for platforms to deal with it, and everyone has different excuses for why this happens. But I think it's important to think about the root causes of these issues, and that I think I struggle with like thankfully, there are amazing experts to talk about what platforms should do, so we should definitely check them out. And moving forward, we should definitely be very aware, especially as in our municipal elections, we should be aware of misinformation, and then also think about our federal elections as well.
Yeah. Okay, want to get to some more questions, so if we continue in the back, that'd be great. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Ashish, and I'm going to shift the whole thing now because I just read an article. Jennifer, I've shared that with you on Twitter. A friend of mine has done a cover story in India which relates to young women and men going in for plastic surgery because their selfies don't look very good. Yeah. So I'll just read a little bit here. There are kids asking for Angelina Jolie's luscious lips, Russell Crowe's jawline, and Cristiano Ronaldo's sharp features. Now, mind you, the reason this is important is India is one of the biggest users of social media. Mm-hmm. WhatsApp has 200 million Indians. Mm-hmm. It has led to lynchings. Mm-hmm. My question is simply, are the social media companies now engaging in human engineering? Are they altering the landscape? And just as a afterword, there is a terrific book to read. It's called World Without Mind by Franklin Foer. Mm-hmm. He talks about addiction. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is what it is. Yeah. It is an addiction. Mm-hmm. You're going there, you're being prompted to keep going back there, back there, back there. So
this is great. Thank you. Would you like to take that, Bianca?
Yeah, I think Jaron Lanier just wrote a book, like 10 Reasons to Get Off Social Media. And this was someone who's a technologist, goes back. Thank you for this question, because it brings up these points. He always says addiction and talks about, to your question, is human engineering going on through these companies? My opinion is that it's not. But what's happening is that all of the worst of our fears and paranoias and all of our self-hatred and all of the things that come out when you're in these contexts are leading to that. So I don't know that it's a direct, I don't think it's an intended consequence piece, but I'll just say my little human example of this, what I've found is so hard to manage on social media is that in any time in real life, if someone comes to talk to me, I answer them, because I would never, if someone came to speak to me in my face and I didn't respond to them, that would be extremely strange. When I'm on social media, if I tweet at someone or say a comment and they don't answer me, it sits with me way more than all the people who respond to me, because it's got this like rejection / like, was that something wrong? I don't know, like it's just, and part of the discourse online is like, you don't have to answer people. And I agree with that, and you don't. But at the same time, it's creating these little places where, all these little vulnerabilities and all of these like really human parts of us, I think are, all the bad ones are on blast and all the wonderful ones are muted. And just to end on that, that's the model of, as you were speaking, you're making me think about the crux of what happens is, it's called surveillance capitalism online right now. Everything is about advertising or making money on your behavior. So the problem with the Facebook and what gets shared, what gets shared is the Facebook. The things is that it's things that trigger negative emotions go way faster. This is part of Lanier's work, is that if something makes somebody mad, and to your point, like there's a racist sentiment and they want to jump on that, that's the stuff that gets shared. And then, so a whole model is fueled by like our worst selves. So I think all of those things lead to the kind of the outcome you're discussing. Absolutely. But not necessarily directly. But I also would never, maybe.
Yeah, there are design principles that are used, and like user interface kind of design to be able to get people to use the platform, to use it consistently, to like interact with it over the course of hours in a day. I think about that for Instagram, for example. Like, I find Instagram more calming than Facebook. It's owned by Facebook, but I don't touch Facebook very often. Go on Instagram and it just seems so like fluffy and great, right? And then so like I feel comforted by going on it, because I don't have to like watch a bunch of news or videos. It's very like calming.
I think it depends who you follow, because I was speaking to
depends.
some students and they don't feel that way about Instagram. They feel this pressure to look a certain way, to buy certain things.
Exactly, to curate, right? The biggest thing is like my 16-year-old sister curates her Instagram, right?
What does that mean?
So like she posts a photo, posts maybe 3 photos, and then deletes all of it, and then posts another set of 3 photos. And the whole idea is that you can't be posting too much. You have to post just enough.
I see.
And you have to have like your follower count really great. And it's like a whole thing.
And then you look to see who comments and what they say and if they're your true friends. And
yeah, and all that stuff, right? And so there's a huge impact on like friendship and like actual social like relationships in most of these scenarios. And a lot of it is designed, and I don't think people meant for that to happen. I think there's a Center for Humane Technology out of SF, and they were talking about how like the person who runs it actually used to be a design ethicist at Google, and he was saying that like we didn't mean for that to happen. Like we didn't mean for all these things, which is true. We always talk about intent, but obviously what ends up happening is that people feel so connected to these platforms. I have friends who aren't friends anymore because of things that happen on Instagram. And it's not like abuse or anything like that. It's like, you know, literally someone not responding to your messages or whatever the case is. It's like, it's definitely shifting some of our relationships and manifesting our bigger anxieties, which when you mix that into political and all the other things that are happening in our lives, it becomes very difficult to parse through what feels real to you.
Thanks. This is a really wonderful panel. My name is Shirley, and my question is, you know, we were talking about bigger logics and should we take them for granted or challenge them? And one of the biggest ones is that what used to be the public sphere is largely taking place on these platforms, and these platforms are private and they're driven by this whatever commercial logic. So what are the solutions for that? Do we get governments to create platforms? Like, no, then if not, then I'm not saying that's a solution, but I'm just saying we're accepting, even in this conversation, it feels like the logic that it is Facebook and that it is Instagram is accepted. So if we really want to break out of that, what else is there and how would we advocate for it?
I guess I would go quickly and talk about there's something really interesting. And so, yeah, the public forum is shifting to private corporations. So my final I'm not in university anymore, but my final paper was actually about the rise of white supremacy online. And a lot of the work I did was like researching public forum, right? Public space. So there was back in the day, it was that people would go to a park or an area or like just a piece of land and they would communicate with one another, ask each other questions, and that was their public forum. And then obviously over time it shifted to an online space. And what's really interesting to think about is Dana Boyd is a sociologist, and she looks at a lot of, her research is a lot on teens and them being online. And she has this really interesting concept where she said that the lack of public space, like physical public spaces, is what pushes a lot of young people online. Right? And so don't shame them for why they want to be online if they don't feel comfortable in public spaces or have access to actual physical environments for them to participate in. And so I do think that, that's a bigger question, right? It's a huge, bigger meta question that's beyond the digital space, right? Do we have access to public places to actually communicate and talk to one another, right? In the physical realm. And then also on top of that, there are many options. People talk about, Facebook being like a public entity, right? And those are conversations that have been up. And I'm not too sure about that. I think right now what we're grappling with, I do think that regulation is important, but the one thing that we should actually just make really big note of is we're talking about regulation within a democratic situation, right? Like a democratic government situation, because we have to recognize in other places where we know you may not be able to, for example, elect or whatever the case is, Facebook is regulated in particular ways, or the internet is regulated in particular ways. Solutions are very difficult to think through, and I think that's where we are at now, and it's where we're trying to figure out what is the role of government, especially here in Canada, in regulating that. But also the bigger thing is I want more public spaces. That's what I would like to see, right? And that's unfortunately not the sexy answer, right?
Well, it's also not what we're talking about this municipal election.
Exactly.
Because of the threat to our democracy. So all these issues are actually connected
Very
right now.
interconnected. Yeah. Do you want to share anything?
No, I think go for another question.
Okay.
Great answer.
I think we have time for another question.
Hi, my name is Erica, and I have a question regarding information security and privacy. In Europe, we saw the new guidelines on data protection and regulations, and I just wanted to know how our government compares to the world, or how much interest is there into improving our regulations in terms of data privacy and protection.
It's a great question because Europe often comes up as a point of comparison to North America.
Yeah, I think in Canada right now, the discussion, I was at a roundtable last week with a lot of people in industry. And as Canada looks to sort of reform its, maybe privacy, anything related to data collection, everybody's looking to Europe and the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which is the law that right now people are saying is the best one, right? So even industry is saying we don't want to go that far because that law, even though it sounds good, is from I've spoken to people in Europe, say it's a very poorly written law, but what it does is it gives regulators the opportunity to lay down big fines. And so the way this is being positioned right now is that industry are the ones showing up, they're lobbying, they're coming to government and saying, you'll kill our business if you try to ramp this up too hard or too high. And that's the dominant voice. So I think this goes back to I don't feel great about, even where we're sitting or even the GDPR. When I think at the city level, like New York also put out, proactive things to have openness around algorithmic accountability and all of this. And I often feel that it's all about all of these laws, or if you look even at, the GDPR, it's all mitigating and it's not proactive enough on regulating outright things being illegal. No, you can't collect that. That's a bad idea, right? So I would love for us to jump forward on that. And what I'll close on saying, and this is my hope that you speak about Canada having this opportunity, I really believe that privacy is a thing that people, if we lead on it, if we build standards around it that you have to abide by, even if they're voluntary, we should thrive. People might want to live here because we take good care of privacy. I think you look 50 years into the future, I think we're going to have immense amounts of even climate refugees in Canada. We need to start to think about protecting everybody's privacy really, really well and doing it now. And I don't, really to go back to your point, I don't think we're doing great. And I also don't think the urgency is there within the people at the table. So I really hope we can find the words to get digital rights, digital justice, and get the public involved in this conversation. But to your point, Jen, man, everything's on fire. And it feels really hard to be hi, I'm here. I'd really like to regulate things in technology. Queen's Park is burning. And you're okay, right? It's hard to make it the priority. So that's, but I'm not feeling great about it and that we need to do a lot of work on it.
Nasma, quickly.
Yeah, not feeling great about it either, unfortunately. But there is a national data and digital consultation currently happening federally. So if you are interested in putting in your input around privacy, there's future of work and unleashing innovation. I know they seem really broad, but you can definitely check that out. That's definitely an opportunity to provide your perspective on those issues because that's the window that they're trying to get as many perspectives as possible. So I don't think we're really great. I think a lot of locally, I don't think we're great at it as well. We have an opportunity to shape what data governance looks like or how we think about how we share information, and we're not there yet, and there isn't a lot of urgency, which I always found really weird, but we're also during election season, so I recognize that it's not out of all, it's threat to democracy, digital, it's kind of hard to navigate. That's the place I'm always at. I'm always oh God, but there's cuts to funding, and I'm the digital piece. And I feel really bad about that all the time. And so I do think that we can do better. That's the funny thing. We're in this really good, we're in rooms where people Canadian businesses want to shift, right? And are willing, right, to hear responses. And, the government definitely does have to really work a lot harder federally, provincially, and locally to really build up the public awareness around these issues, because we should not have for-profit entities or corporations in many ways shaping what data governance looks like. We should not have corporations thinking about what data trusts or whatever the case is looks like, right, for us. It should be us shaping it and then they follow the rules. But for that to happen, we have to have larger scale public consultations and engagement. And that's not happening at the rate that I think it should happen. There is a lot of work to be done. And right now, I'm going to be honest, it's a lot of talk. It's a lot of talk and very little game, but we have to make sure there's a political will, especially within communities, to ask for that as well and demand it.
Well, a lot to think about. Nasma, Bianca, thank you for such an inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. And to the audience, wow, those questions were incredible. We really appreciate your support and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.